Welcome to a very special episode of Humans of Bitcoin. I worked hard on getting him on the show because he is an investigative journalist, host of the long form podcast, regularly writes in The New Yorker and Wired magazine. And the subject of his book, called Mastermind, is about Paul Le Roux. And there's a chance he's Satoshi. Here is Evan Ratliff, and you're listening to Humans of Bitcoin. This is the season finale of season 7. This is your host, Matt Aaron. I hope you enjoy the show.
And there's no question that he's a brilliant guy by some definition of brilliant, whether it's technically he's extremely talented software developer, developed his own encryption software called Encryption for the Masses. He may or may not have had a hand in that becoming TrueCrypt, TrueCrypt was most certainly based on Paul Le Roux' software. Explicitly so. When they announced TrueCrypt, they said it's a successor to E4M. It uses E4M code that Paul Le Roux wrote. So I have differing sources on whether or not he denies being involved in TrueCrypt. But all that to say, technically, he's a very talented person in terms of the operation that he built and just the grandiose nature of it and the amount of projects that were involved and the amount of crimes that were committed. It is, I wouldn't say admire, I would say fascinate. It's fascinating and it was fascinating to me for many years to sort of figure out how he did it and how it all worked. When there were also people killed, and that, I think that brings it all back down to earth in terms of, real people who were at the very least guilty of very, very minimal skimming of money, and at the most totally innocent people were killed by him. And so it's also a very serious thing. But if you look at it just as the craziness of the operation, it is worth reflecting on how did one person possibly do all of this?
I guess what brought this whole thing together, and you mentioned you had in the book that you had investigated whether Le Roux was Satoshi before, 3 years ago. But I guess it was on a court document. They found that Craig Wright had, in a footnote, Le Roux' name showed up there, right? And so I think it's fair to say that a lot of people have been skeptical of Craig Wright, and he's been caught with, the facts just don't line up. Do you have any insight whether Le Roux ever worked with or knows Craig Wright?
I would say I don't have necessarily any insight into that. So just to give a little background, when I wrote the book, I wrote a series of stories for the Atavist magazine, which is the magazine that I used to edit, that sort of preceded the book. And when those came out, actually a number of people were speculating that Paul could be Satoshi. So I got emails from people saying, hey, have you seen this? Have you seen that? One of the big things was this passport that I had been sent to me, Paul Le Roux' diplomatic passport, which I published, which is now a very widely circulating image of a passport from the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, that Paul Le Roux had obtained, in which his real name is Paul Calder Le Roux. The full name was Paul Calder Le Roux Solochi. Looks very much like Satoshi on first glance. So that piece, that was already out. So people had speculated, maybe it is. People would email me and say, hey, maybe it's him. So I did spend some time looking into it. I couldn't find anything that would really connect them. And so in the book, I wrote, essentially, I found nothing. Not nothing, but I didn't find anything definitive. I can't remember exactly what I wrote. So then I was done with it at that point. The book came out in January. I was happy to never speak of Satoshi again in terms of my reporting. But then this footnote came out, and with the footnote, a lot of the filing is redacted. So basically, Craig Wright was deposed in the case. He was asked a question. Several questions he kind of refused to answer. And this was his lawyer saying, okay, here are the answers, but we would like them to be sealed by the court. That was what the filing was. And there was a partial footnote that was unredacted. That partial footnote led to Paul Le Roux' Wikipedia page and an article about Paul Le Roux. So clearly Paul Le Roux' name was mentioned. The interesting thing is, if you look at the context, it seems very likely that it was mentioned because the opposing lawyers asked him about it. So for the opposing lawyers to have known Paul Le Roux' name was associated with this, that would mean most likely that it is somewhere in the documents, discovery documents that they received. So somewhere they found this connection. They said, what's up with Paul Le Roux? That seems like the most likely thing. But again, part of it's redacted, so you can't tell. So I think the speculation would be that they did know each other somehow, and the document implies that Craig Wright helped catch Paul Le Roux. Now, I will say, I've talked to a lot of law enforcement that chased Paul Le Roux. I have never heard of Craig Wright being involved. None of them have ever heard of Craig Wright either. There's no evidence that I have ever seen that Craig Wright was involved in catching Paul Le Roux. I know how Paul Le Roux was caught. So that part I tend to strongly doubt if that's the assertion. On the other hand, the idea that they could have known each other seems quite likely to me, partly because, for two reasons. One, they were both involved in online gaming, which Paul Le Roux was in 2008. He had a company in Costa Rica called The Betting Machine that he was trying to get off the ground. He had written casino software over the years, dating back to 2003, 2004. Craig Wright was involved in that area. And the other reason, and this is like one of the crazy things that is very difficult to chase down the reality of, but I was told in 2016, before any of this, by Paul Le Roux's cousin that he knew Calvin Ayre. And he said he knew Calvin Ayre, and he believed even that he was sort of doing something for Calvin Ayre, maybe even getting him a passport. This is what this cousin told me.
Whoa.
Now, Calvin Ayre denies that. He sent me a statement saying, I've never heard of Paul Le Roux before a few weeks ago when all this stuff came out. So just because Paul Le Roux told his cousin that he knew Calvin Ayre, that doesn't mean that he did. I mean, anyone can claim to know Calvin Ayre. He was a well-known, famous billionaire at that point. He was on the cover of Forbes magazine. He was also involved in business in the Philippines, where Paul Le Roux not only was a huge figure, but controlled the flow of information around him. Like, he had moles everywhere. So it seems possible that Paul Le Roux just made up, like maybe he was trying to like curry favor with Calvin Ayre, so he was going to get him a passport and then give it to him and show up. So, but it's one of these things which sort of like forms the backbone of the story that I wrote for Wired about Paul Le Roux Satoshi, where it's a coincidence that is very tantalizing. And if you start piling them all up, you get to a place where you can say, wow, there's something here. Paul Le Roux is a good candidate for Satoshi, but none of them actually prove anything, if that makes sense.
Let me see if I can sum up your conclusion in terms of Le Roux being Satoshi. It's that unlikely, but out of all the candidates that during your investigation, not just of Le Roux, but just recently, he seems like if you had to place money on him, again, we're not talking 1-to-1, we're talking 7-to-1, 15-to-1, you'd probably pick Le Roux in a horse race with many horses.
Yes, I would bet on Le Roux, I think, versus other candidates. I mean, I love betting on stuff, even kind of like long shot loser bets. So yeah, if you line up all the candidates, I think, first of all, Le Roux built software that in many ways is similar to Bitcoin. Now, I had Gregory Maxwell do an actual code comparison with E4M and Bitcoin. He basically said, the original Bitcoin, the Satoshi Bitcoin software, and he basically said, if the same person did it, their style would have had to change, but they're 10 years apart. So he couldn't really find anything definitive. He found substantial differences. He found some similarities, and he kind of said, it's a wash. This doesn't really prove anything one way or the other. But what makes Le Roux such a good candidate is that the way that he built and released E4M is parallel in many ways to the way that Bitcoin was released. He worked on it himself quietly, then he just showed up on a forum and released it. And some of the things, like for instance, one of the things he did when he worked on it quietly was that he would send an email to someone like the author of SSL and say, hey, I just want to see how to cite you correctly in my software. And Satoshi sent very similar emails, and the first email he ever sent was to add him back, and it was very similar. And I sent a copy of the one that Le Roux sent about E4M to add him back, and he said, yeah, there's a lot of similarities. They're like short and to the point, and they're asking this thing. So in terms of how the software was released, I think there's a lot of parallels. The fact that he's a C++ coder who knows how to do this stuff, who's very into encryption, all of that stuff lines up. And if you're going to have a candidate, you got to have a candidate who's written software. It doesn't seem like it makes any sense to me to have a candidate who has not written software, particularly this type of open source software, all of the conventions of it. You just don't do that out of anywhere. Le Roux, motivationally, lines up extremely well. He's anti-government, obviously, for many reasons, but he had complaints about banks going out back to before he was involved in crime. I mean, I have writings of his where he talks about the banking system. He worked for banks. So he was a software programmer for big banks in Australia and the Netherlands. That was his day job, working on Swift money transfers and things like that. So he had an intimate knowledge of the banking system. So he had his online pharmaceutical network, which had all kinds of payment problems, like credit card processors being shut down. So from a sort of motivations and philosophical point of view, he also fits. There's a lot of little writing things that you can match up. that kind of fit. There's some that don't, like 2 spaces after a period. Le Roux always used 1 space after a period, but then like you can autocorrect for that stuff. You know, that once you're in the weeds with that, you can find whatever you want. And so to your original question about his sort of overall odds, ultimately I piled all that stuff up and I said, wow, I think he's the best one of any of them when I look into them. Of the candidates that are out there, I think he's the best one. And then I like snapped out of that and realized, but that doesn't mean anything, because what is the universe of possible candidates? Like the universe of possible candidates is at the very least dozens, maybe hundreds, thousands. And we're talking about people who can code in this way, have written open source software in some sense, are have thoughts about the banking system, are interested in digital currency. It could be hundreds of people. And so I wouldn't bet on him in the spectrum of the broad number of candidates, nor did I find anything in literally hundreds of thousands of data points that I have about Paul Le Roux that was a real smoking gun. There was no website that tied him to the anonymous sources, which is where Bitcoin.org was registered. He didn't use GMX, the email server that Satoshi used. Either one of them, he never used those. Now you could say he had perfect OPSEC, so he just like used them once for that. But Paul Le Roux did thousands and thousands of things online, and maybe he never made a mistake. So my overall point is like, without something that actually forensically proves the connection, and obviously without the person who is Satoshi or people who are Satoshi doing what they need to do to prove it, you're left with this sort of like piles of evidence that you're comparing against each other. And it's fun to compare them against the other people, but the real Satoshi has like a pile of evidence so high that's just out there. And like, you can't find it because you don't know who that is. You know what I mean? Like, it's sort of like a game. It's not a proof, it's a game.